Welcome to Refuting Rationality, the show where I refute the YouTube atheist Rationality Rules. In today's episode, Mr. Rationality is going to try and prove contradictions in God's nature by misunderstanding God's nature. Let's begin.
Anyhow, to get to the topic at hand, it's widely believed that one can't prove a negative. That one can't, to name but a few examples, prove that Santa, unicorns, God, or Russell's celestial teapot doesn't exist. But this isn't necessarily true. Take Russell's teapot for example. If Russell was to assert that between Earth and Mars there is a microscopic teapot orbiting the Sun, then, in this case, it might well be impossible, or as good as impossible, to prove the negative. But if Russell was to also assert that the teapot is both entirely made of china and entirely made of steel, then we can prove the negative because this concept violates the law of non-contradiction, which states that contradictory statements cannot both be true in the same sense and at the same time. Nothing can be made entirely of china and simultaneously entirely of steel. This isn't possible, and hence, by proving the negative, we can prove the non-existence of such a teapot. Now, some will object to this by saying that we don't know with absolute certainty that nothing can violate the law of non-contradiction. But I would reply by saying that, with the exception of our own existence, we know absolutely nothing with absolute certainty.
Good night, everybody!
Well, that was quick. I could literally end the video right here, since Mr. Rationality just admitted he doesn't know anything. Now I know what you're saying. He did admit that he knows he exists. The problem is, if that's the only thing he knows, then he could never justify it, which means he can't even know that. And as I've stated in a previous video, absolute certainty is redundant. 100% certain is redundant. If you are 100% sure of something, then you are certain of it. If you are certain of it, then you know it. Perfect knowledge would imply that you know everything. If I told you my name and told you I was 99% certain that that was my name, and at no point I had amnesia, you would think I was a little mad. Saying you're only 99% certain of something implies that you could be wrong, and if you could be wrong, then you don't know it. And you can make any example you like to prove this. Just make any knowledge claim and then follow it by, but I could be wrong about that. Not only is it ridiculous, say it with something that you should so obviously know, like your name or where you are or what you're doing, but it would mean that you don't know it. Also, unicorns do exist. Not the one he pictured, of course, but narwhals are unicorns, rhinoceroses are unicorns, and there's probably some extinct varieties as well. As for the law of non-contradiction, assuming he was actually able to know things, which he is, though he claims not to, how in his worldview would he explain the law of non-contradiction? Where did it come from? How does he know it applies everywhere and at all times? How can he explain its existence?
And so to demand that we have absolute certainty when proving a negative, but not absolute certainty when proving a positive, is unjustifiably inconsistent. And so, this objection doesn't stand. Now, before I tie this to the various concepts of the Abrahamic God, I just want to point out two things. The first is that the reason why people say you can't prove a negative is actually to convey that the burden of proof is on those who make an assertion, and that those who dispute the assertion don't have a burden of disproof. And of course, this is true, and this is the very purpose of Russell's teapot. It illustrates the nature of the burden of proof. It doesn't illustrate that you can't prove a negative. And the second thing I want to point out is that many negatives are actually extremely easy to prove, both colloquially and scientifically. For example, if I was to say to you that you can't prove that this cup isn't full of tea, and you had access to the cup and a clear understanding of all definitions, then of course you can prove the negative. It's not full of tea. But it should be. What's more, and to really knock this out of the park, scientific papers prove negatives all of the time. For example, the assertion that cell phones cause cancer has been overwhelmingly proven false. Or in other words, the negative assertion that you can't prove that cell phones don't cause cancer has been proven. Now again, such proof isn't absolute, but neither is any proof. positive or negative.
I'm mainly cutting them off here just to break up the clip. I don't actually have anything to say about this one. Someone smarter than me might be able to argue that absolute proof point he made, but I don't have anything for it. The next few clips get into the meat of the issue.
Over the thousands of years since its inception, there have been countless definitions asserted for this entity, some of which insisting that it's a white man who physically manifests above the clouds, and others that it's 3 entities rather than 1, who all care deeply about who you sleep with and in what position. But the most popular definitions, at least today, are 1. A transcendent and eternal being who created absolutely everything, which is actually a definition of the deistic God, not the Abrahamic God. And 2. A transcendent and eternal being who created absolutely everything, who's omnipotent, meaning that it has unlimited power, omniscient, meaning that it has unlimited knowledge, omnipresent, meaning that it's everywhere at all times, and omnibenevolent, meaning that it's all-loving and infinitely good. Oh, and it's worth noting that many theists additionally define this being to be just, merciful, and responsible for imbuing mankind with free will. Now admittedly, the first definition can't be proven false, because, like the existence of an intangible, invisible and undetectable celestial teapot, one would need unavailable and perhaps even impossible resources and knowledge to do so. But the second definition can be proven false, and we can do so by demonstrating that one or more of its attributes are internally contradictory, that one or more of its attributes contradict a law of 4, or that 2 or more of its attributes contradict one another. And so, let's name but just a few of these contradictions.
Not a whole lot to say on this one, only that he strawmanned Christianity at one point in there, mainly because he wanted to be crass. And the definitions of just, merciful, and what was the third one? Imbuing free will? Those would all fit under omnibenevolent. I can say words. Omnibenevolent.
Starting with omnipotence. As observed by the 12th century polymath Averroes, one can prove that the very concept of omnipotence is self-contradictory by asking the simple question, can an omnipotent being create a stone so heavy that it cannot lift it? If the answer is yes, then the being's power is limited because it cannot lift the stone. But if the answer is no, then the being's power is limited because it cannot create the stone. And hence, an omnipotent being cannot exist. Now it's worth noting that while this crushes the most popular definition of omnipotence, it doesn't crush all definitions. But that's a rabbit hole we'll dive down at a further date.
This is such an easy argument to refute. Normally, it's just a bifurcation fallacy, by ignoring the possibility of a tie. However, the way it's phrased in this particular version actually also makes it begging the question, because the second line says, because it cannot create the stone. That very line implies a limit. Therefore, he's assuming what he set out to prove. If you have 2 omnipotent beings having a tug of war without rope, because I don't want to make an omnipotent rope, then who wins? If person A wins, then person B is not omnipotent. If person B wins, then person A is not omnipotent. But if neither win, if they are stuck in the tug of war forever, then they are both equal, and therefore either omnipotent or not, which a tug of war is not going to tell you whether they are actually omnipotent, but it will tell you if they're both omnipotent or not. Changing it to creating a rock and lifting a rock is basically the same thing, except it shifts it in a way to hide the bifurcation fallacy. But even though it hides the bifurcation fallacy of the argument, it also shows the omnipotence. Because if he creates rock A and then lifts it, then he creates a heavier rock B, but then he lifts that. So he creates rock C, etc., etc., ad infinitum. The statement, but if the answer is no, then the being's power is limited, assumes that he just stopped creating stones because he couldn't do it anymore. It is assuming the very limit he's trying to prove.
Moving on, let's now look at just some of the attributes that contradict one another. First off, if a being is omnipotent, then it's necessarily already omniscient and omnipresent. because it must already know everything and be everywhere in order to have unlimited power. And so saying God is omnipotent, omniscient and omnipresent is like saying that the sea contains water, hydrogen and oxygen. Considering that hydrogen and oxygen are constituents of water, one might as well say the sea contains water. Now sure, this isn't so much of a game-ending flaw, but it certainly demonstrates that theists tend not to understand the nature of these concepts.
That last line is so ironic. He claims that omniscience and omnipresence are preconditions of omnipotence, but he does nothing to justify this except making a false analogy. Meanwhile, I can give you a proper analogy of a character who does have omnipotence, but does not have omniscience or omnipresence, and that is Grand Zeno from Dragon Ball Dragon Ball Super. Throughout that show, it's made abundantly clear that Grand Zeno is omnipotent, but it is also made abundantly clear that he does not know everything and is not everywhere. Now, of course, Dragon Ball is not exactly the most realistic show, but at least it is perfectly logical to imagine an entity with unlimited power without unlimited knowledge, and without being everywhere at once. So Mr. Rationality has his work cut out for him if he wants to prove that all three of those are redundant. I would have said mutually exclusive. However, technically they are mutually exclusive because only one being has all three of those. God. And God is the only one to possess any of those three, let alone all of them. So a better analogy would have been comparing God to an atom, and the omnipotence being a proton, omniscience being a neutron, and omnipresence being the electrons. Obviously it's not a great analogy since he has more attributes than just those three, but it's a lot better than what he was trying to pull.
A contradiction that is a game-ending flaw, however, is the combination of omniscience and human free will.
Oh wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
Because if a being has unlimited knowledge, omniscience, then it knows all things, including the future. But if the future is known, then free will, the ability to consciously do otherwise, isn't possible.
My knowledge of your future does not affect your future, and it certainly doesn't affect the choices you make in that future. My knowledge of the future would only affect my decisions, and with infinite knowledge comes infinite decisions, or I should say infinite choices. And it is a bit ironic for an evolutionist to try and argue for free will, since according to his worldview, life is just a chemical chain reaction, and if life is just a chemical chain reaction, then all choices, actually getting ahead of myself, he also believes that consciousness comes from the physical brain, and if consciousness is a result of the brain, then consciousness is the result of the same chemical chain reaction that would have caused the brain, which means any free will you have, any choices you make, will also be determined by that same chemical reaction. Just a never-ending chain of cause and effect, with no choices in between. And of course, if he says he doesn't actually believe in free will, then his argument is moot, because if he doesn't have the free will to even make the argument, then he hasn't really made an argument, just word salad.
And finally, let's look at two omni-attributes that are incompatible with reality, that being omnipotence and omnibenevolence. If a being existed with these attributes, then it would necessarily create the best possible universe, because it has unlimited power, omnipotence, and it's infinitely good, omnibenevolence. But one can easily think of a universe that's better than this one. For example, one in which innocent babies aren't born with cancer. Or to put it another way, and to expand upon a quote from the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Now there's no two ways around this. If a being exists that is willing to prevent evil, that is omnibenevolent, but is not able, that is, does not have the power to do so, then this being is not omnipotent. Epicurus continues, is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Again, this sentence is logically valid. If a being exists that is able to prevent innocent babies from being born with leukemia, but is not willing, then this being is a malevolent colossus prick. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? And again, this sentence is logically valid, and I personally think that it's the nail in the coffin for most theists. If a being exists that is able and willing to prevent evil, then it logically follows that evil cannot exist. But evil does exist, and therefore this being does not exist, despite the countless backflips apologists do in the attempt to rebut this. And Epicurus concludes with, is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God?
The line, then he is malevolent, is a non sequitur, or perhaps a bifurcation fallacy. God can prevent evil, but in order to prevent evil, he would have to prevent free will, and an all-loving God would not prevent free will, especially when we are made in his image, and therefore should also be loving. But we can't be loving if we don't have free will. And if it's truly free will, then it would necessarily come with the possibility to do evil. Every evil in the world is the result of man exercising his free will. And because God is perfectly just, all evil will be punished accordingly. And because he is perfectly merciful, he himself paid the price for every evil, so that if you do not want to pay the price for the evil you have committed, and this applies to everybody, then you can ask God to take the payment for you. He's already done it, but you still have to make the choice to accept it. Otherwise, you'll have to pay for your own evil.